All right. Well, welcome everybody. It's really good to see some comment readers here on a late June day. Some of you may know my name is Ann Snyder. I'm the editor of Comment Magazine. And as those of you who have been reading us, following us along likely know or picked up, we are in an exciting stage of growth. We're seeking to respond to growing public demand that we take our content and figure out ways to have it sort of be better metabolized in relationship between readers, between writers, between readers and writers, and more broadly between sort of all of those civic leaders and common good actors that are craving a space to think more slowly and more constructively together in the atmosphere of a Christian imagination that is as humane as it is integrating and generative. So we're here. This is an inaugural kind of experiment for us, our first author conversation. Chelsea Bombino and Laura Fabrycky have each written an essay independent of one another in two different issues. So if you're print subscribers, you've probably gotten these and seen hopefully the ways in which they visually correspond. And the essays, to me, I mean, it was a bit intentional in commissioning them, but surprised me because you never quite know what authors are going to come up with. They just seem like cousins of essays to me, or at the least sort of friends in the making as pieces. Comment has been finishing up this sort of 6-month series on social change in our podcast and in our print and online content. How does social change, how has it happened in different times in history? And how could perhaps what we would view it as its more redemptive, uniting variety could yet happen today? And we have been especially curious about kind of the less public, more organic, but still intentional, hidden beginnings of conversation and community that eventually yield shifts in societal norms and cultural consensus. How might we, in this kind of celebrity fawning, self-image making age, become more attuned to the conditions required for careful incubation of relationship and wrestling that patiently nurture sort of the quiet before a big sort of social wave? Is there a different logic than the kind of status quo elite conference or the Twitter hashtag rush or sort of strategy upon strategy around building thick networks, but not with a clear sense of telos? Is there maybe a different logic and way of kind of weaving change that we would do well to put some language to and to develop a fresh framework for? So as Comment in our own right is trying to figure out actively how a Christian humanist tradition might be more powerfully felt and activated in today's public square, I personally have been puzzling around different pathways of organizational coordination, cross-sector collaboration, sort of the dynamic between big zeitgeist concepts and local praxis. And as I've been trying to figure out our own role as a magazine that's trying to equip and convene various folks across North America, Chelsea and Laura here have planted an unusual question in my own deliberations, namely, what would it look like to model more of our praxis on the norm of female embodiment, an ethos of interconnection and radical hospitality to life? It's a provocative idea, one that might make some of you uncomfortable, if not suspicious, and I totally get that. But I think I'd just like to reassure you that the question itself does pick up a long history of thought and practice by Christian thinkers and movers and shakers like Edith Stein and Hildegard von Bingen and Dorothy Day and Elizabeth Seton. Monastic communities of women religious have often understood their charism, among others, to witness to the Christian distinctive of incarnation as the event that upends and remakes everything, precisely as women walking in the line of Mary, whose vulnerable yes to God changed history. So we're going to dive into this strange yet, I think, powerful idea today with the help of Chelsea and Laura's essays. Hopefully you've read them. Chelsea's, which she wrote with her husband Josh, is titled The Wombing of Social Movements, Unearthing the Role of Spiritual Motherhood. And Laura's is titled The Birds and the Beguines, Remembering Habitually Forgotten Female Saints. Both of these essays dig into historical realities that aren't often included in our history books, sort of realities of hiddenness and motherhood and civic housekeeping and of political love. And both of these authors, Chelsea and Laura, I think have a sixth sense that maybe there is some public hunger building right now for the revival and recovery of these realities in our midst today. So Chelsea, Laura, thank you so much for your courage to unpeel these kind of unwieldy subjects and histories today on the backs of your respective essays. As you know, I just loved editing both of them and working with you on them. Welcome. And I'll just also say to those of you, the readers watching, please feel free to type in questions in the chat, and we'll leave kind of the last third of this hour to having more of a conversation with you, with our contributors. So welcome, Chelsea, Laura. Thanks for being here. I want to start right off the bat, Chelsea, with you, just because I think this phrase is both intriguing, but also so, I don't know, like Enya or something. It's big, and it's also like ethereal. You were the first to mention this notion of spiritual motherhood to me in the context of an institutional ecosystem, and more specifically, kind of a philanthropic seat inside that ecosystem. You now work at the Fetzer Institute, and you mentioned in the context of sort of trying to flesh out a fuller picture of how social change germinates. Could you describe a bit of the journey that led you to this spiritual motherhood paradigm, and also just sort of educating all of us here, especially those who aren't familiar with it? What is this spiritual motherhood notion trying to get at?
Yeah, and I'll keep my remarks brief because I know we're tight on time. Maybe I'll illustrate it through a few stories. So spiritual motherhood is a term that, as far as I know, I am not Catholic, but I teach it, I adjunct at Mount St. Mary's, which is a Catholic university in Maryland, is rooted in kind of Catholic theology. You could go back very far into church history. As we know, Julian of Norwich talks about Christ our mother, not challenging the gender identity of Christ, certainly, but bringing the elements, the maternal or possibly sisterly or archetypally feminine elements of the image of God to bear on how we understand the wholeness of flourishing. And so for me, this term is one that should be troubled. It's not, maybe it's not even where we land. It's certainly not supposed to invite, or maybe it should, but not invite solely just debate on the semantics. I'm fine to call it something completely else. I've heard a lot of spiritual sisterhood language used, and perhaps even non-gendered language is best, and has done some really powerful work on the Seedbeds of social change. I'd really commend your listeners if you have not seen the latest issue. Really, it starts with a call to the small. So when I approach this, I think about spiritual motherhood as embracing what kind of Jacques Maritain would call a whole of wholes. So when we think about, I think we all are writers on this call. I know even in many ways, that's kind of for me personally, outside of my role as daughter of Christ, mother, wife, program officer at a foundation, I've always write. When I think about source material, if I think about writing for a policy piece or for a grant report, I don't often think it's kosher to include my children, to include my garden, to include the conversation that wasn't with the best-selling author or with the institutional leader, but that was with the groundskeeper at Duke Divinity's Chapel, where I was 2 weeks ago. And to think about finding God's spirit and deep spiritual wisdom and relational connectivity in all of those places, in our own relationship with God, in our own spiritual practices, in our interpersonal relationships, in our institutional connections, because whether we like it or not, we are all connected through institutions to each other, and in kind of the whole of society, which for me does very importantly include the natural world. Kind of to historically situate this, I live in Maryland, and I don't think that's an accident, actually. I don't think I'll always live here, but Maryland has a lot of Catholic history, which I am drawn to, not as someone who's necessarily going to become Catholic, but it's really deep in my own spiritual life. So I did not start teaching at Mount St. Mary's aware of the history. And I've learned about the story of Elizabeth Seton, which you all can go and find for yourself if you don't know. But she was a woman who was an Episcopalian, kind of an upper crusty, probably snobby one, who was widowed at 29. And through a series of events, come to find a closer relationship to Christ through Mary. And that really called her to leave her very upper crusty New York life because she couldn't find work. People wouldn't employ her as a teacher. People wouldn't send their children to her to become educated because they were afraid she would convert them to Catholicism. So she found a way to start her own order, her own institution, really. Up until that point, my understanding really is you couldn't really have dependents and be a nun. There wasn't a path for that. There's still not a path for that. If I could be a married nun with children, I probably would be. And she found a way, and she created a system where she played within the system of the church, and she saw the beauty there. And she also found ways to transform the system from within. And it was usually based on the love and genuine outpouring of her own deep spiritual life, where she did draw from things like just not sexy things, right? Like from the experience that her husband had, passing away from tuberculosis, from her own early death, from the deaths of her children, from kind of the environment, the physical environment that led to the deaths of several of her fellow sisters. She started a religious community in Emmitsburg, Maryland. Emmitsburg now is a community that has a lot of suffering and other challenges, but has this beautiful, still sustained religious community that has spread throughout the world, that now is the Sisters of Charity, that has a really beautiful kind of life-changing vision that she started, where she was able to continue to mother her children, educate others, be in a relationship with a very patriarchal, centralized, top-down religious institution. And she found a way to be, in some ways, an institutional leader. But she always said, like, my goal was not to start an institution. My goal was to show up as a mother and a sister in Christ to others. And I had to also support my family in doing so. So that, for me, like, that's a great example of a historical, but one that has deep current resonance. When I think about like a living example right now, I actually think about a woman who's retiring from Mount St. Mary's just this year. And her name's Dana Sowers. And I met her actually when I was at the CPJ, if y'all were on the webinar with Common a few years ago. And she and several other professors from Mount St. Mary's actually joined a program CPJ was running on how to build your institutional capacity for legal health, of all things. I'm a lawyer by background. And we connected personally. And over a longer term relationship, she invited me to come speak to her students. And then we formed family connections now. But eventually she asked if I would consider helping her teach. And when I think about the legacy Dana is leaving and the ways in which Mount St. Mary's is not actually continuing the program she started, my heart kind of actually breaks, because so many small private, Christian and otherwise, liberal arts schools now that are not Harvard. We know Harvard's fine. We know that they're suffering financially. We know that they're trying to do justice to students who have been excluded from educational opportunities. They're trying to open more doors to racial minorities and other students at disadvantage. And when those students come to campus, they're often not retained. And the Mount's numbers for retention are really challenging right now. And there's still not that institutional connection that it is the spiritual mothers on campus. It is the Danas. It is the executive assistants in the president's office. It is the librarian aides who are feeding students and having deep relationships with students that are helping them stay there. So that might seem like a benign example, but Dana's in her 60s. She's had over 3,000 students in her career. She started a podcast for Mount St. Mary's, which has reached thousands of people around the world. And so you can measure her impact institutionally. Certainly, I don't think spiritual motherhood is saying, like, let's displace institutions or let's not have rational, linear, scalable forms of measurement. It's just saying is that all there is? And how do we bring the wholeness of who we are into the how and what that we do?
Thanks, Chelsea. Yeah, and just to pick up on that, I should have, I kind of made a choice not to overly share your bios, assuming people coming on this call have read them already. But part of my sort of mischievous delight in having this conversation with the two of you is that each of you academically and professionally are quite steeped as political theologians and philosophers in your own right, with a real appreciation for systems and institutions and what you might call slightly more kind of machine-like, engineering-like structures in our world. And yet you have also turned your eye to this more organic stuff that may be the gift, a little bit of what we might call feminine sight. But I just want to sort of recognize your credibility, in your case, Chelsea, as a lawyer, in your case, Laura, as an author and a scholar on politics. So thanks for that, Chelsea. These notions of sort of legacy and what endures over generations is very interesting to me. And I've noticed this pattern with sort of those sort of long-term effects that are rooted in some choice that I think you use this phrase like gentle subversion, gently subversive, which is sort of a trait that I think is characteristic of spiritual motherhood itself, as I'm growing to understand this sort of paradigm. And it's a quality I smelled right from the beginning in not really editing it, hardly needed any editing, but working with Laura on her beautiful essay on the Beguines and her rendering of them. And she has a bit of what I call like a holy defiance in her own tone and recovering the witness of these women. So Laura, I'd love for you to, let's hear that voice now. Who were the Beguines and why have they captured you for these last number of years, your own imagination?
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, everybody. Holy Defiance. So the essay grew out of my discovering, in some ways, the same way that I did with Bonhoeffer, by living in a new place. And I think I actually have to live places and see things to actually have them make sense. I have to actually kind of experience them. So the Beguines began, and as I say, organically, they appeared in some ways, not with a single figurehead. It's an organic movement of lay religious women that began appearing on the historical scene in the late 12th century and into the 13th century. And there are a number of speculations as to why it happened. There are theories about that there was a surplus of women, there weren't enough men to marry them off to, the convents were stuffed already, and what do we do with this surplus of women? That's sort of one way that historians have talked about them. I took a slightly different angle in that I sort of encountered my own sense of gap, my own sense of amnesia, and sort of discovering my amnesia. I think it's an amnesia that is persistent and often built into what we describe as knowledge, but it lacks accounting for genuine historical record. So the defiance, in some way, that you might hear in my essay is both in a sense of having, I would say, a very palpable sense of how our failure, and when I say our, I might mean those of us who were raised, who have been and remain in the Christian tradition, raised in the Christian tradition, how rare it is that we hear the lives of women as full contributors to Christian history, to Christian culture, and then even more so to history and to culture across the board. We rarely hear it narrated in such fulsome ways, which is just plainly bad history. And to say it even more starkly, it's bad science. What I was particularly captured by living in Belgium was coming across places where there was just artifact. There was evidence of a dwelling, and it might be a small house that has a sign on it that says it was where Beguines lived. It could be a large structure that now probably houses coffee shops and art galleries and other boutique stores, but might have some plaques and some statues that depict this was a significant place where these women, Beguines, lived. And the Beguines, their history in some ways comes to an end. And that was sort of when I began to know about them in a more fully orbed way in 2013, when the last Beguine died. Her name was Marcella Patin. She died in 2013, and The Economist actually ran an obituary about her, which is a pretty, singular place to be in passing. And she's honored in the Beguinhof or Beguinage, where she lived in Kortrijk in Belgium. And I wanted to explore them in some ways because making contact with the artifacts of their lives and making contact with my own palpable sense of amnesia put me into contact with something that I can only describe as shame. And the experience at times of being female and Christian that is filled with shame. And some of the shame is falling outside of what is considered kind of standard human knowing and human experience, and what might ground knowledge and what grounds authority. And that there is something about being female that presents somehow a particular challenge to God and a particular challenge to human endeavor. And I think the fact that these women and their artifacts of life, and I'll talk a little bit more about why their artifacts came to be with these houses and homes and what constituted their lives, helped me to see the value of my life and also to re-see the world. And to discover in some ways people that I have likely overlooked out of that practiced amnesia, and that I have routinely undervalued because of their being in this other category as female. So the Beguines, to go back to the late 12th and early 13th centuries, they were women that wanted to have, and I would say that at this time in history, there was great religious experimentation. There was a very strong sense that the church needed reform, and there were already lots of monastic and other kinds of spiritual experimentation that was happening at the time. So in some ways, the Beguines are completely of a piece with their historical moment. But they were women that basically took simple vows, and they would do so to a priest or to a bishop. And the simplicity of their vows entailed they voluntarily walked into these vows, which most people saw as being suspicious. That was something that women really shouldn't do. Women did not actually have the agency, or they shouldn't have the will to take up a vow for themselves. And they were simple insofar as they were not legally binding. So for a woman to enter a convent or to enter marriage, it was to enter into a legal relationship that was binding on her life for the duration of her life. A simple vow was a vow which entailed some flexibility. She was always free to leave. Again, that's suspicious. She was not allowed to be married. When a Beguine would enter this vow, she had to be single or widowed. So there wasn't this kind of idealizing of virginity. But she also was entering a community of other vow keepers that actually did have a shape to its life. These women prayed together. So in some ways they kind of kept hours as a traditional monastic might, but they were also world facing in that they served using in some ways what we would call standard spiritual disciplines, the tools of the faith, postures of hospitality to strangers, to the poor, to orphans, refugees, and to widows. And they also had a particular charism to the dying and the dead. And they were known for their piety and their prayers, certainly offering what we might describe as hospice care, but then prayers that would lift the dead's soul to God and asking him for his grace and mercy upon them. And so offering care for a wider range of people. And they also were quite adamant about being self-governing. They did not actually form a larger institution, and they often resisted institutional takeover by the church. They did not have to surrender property when they entered into these communities. And sometimes the communities were small, meaning literally a small group of women who held themselves to this vow, and they might not have actually lived together. But in time, they actually did come to have much larger sort of courtyard experiences or court dwellings. And these would be the artifacts that I was discovering. But they earned money. So they maintained a kind of economic independence that they often preserved, playing ecclesiastical and secular powers against one another. They were willing to pay taxes in order to kind of use the power of the state, or of, the ruling power, the ruling secular power, to resist the takeover, the institutional takeover of the church, to preserve that kind of independence. That kind of operation was completely unheard of among women, and certainly in this time frame. And as I put in my essay, they discovered ground that people did not know existed for women or by women, and they held it for quite some time.
That's some powerful stuff, Laura, every which way you cut it. Thank you. If I could just ask a slight sequel question specific to you again. The Beguines, when you talk about this woman who was honored in The Economist in an obit in 2013, but largely we kind of understand their collective presence to have sort of petered out 15th century or 16th, early 16th century. How do we understand sort of their disappearance? And would you say that implies some form of failure, or even a waste? Like, I'm just curious how you and historians think about that.
I'm not a historian, so I will speak as someone. I would say their lives have not been wasted on mine. And I think there is a deep hunger, not just out of history, but there is a deep hunger for models of saintliness that might extend beyond sort of the typical models that we have. And that, to me, that kind of the populations that actually are out there that history can actually recover for us are really important, I think, especially in times when we are feeling destabilized institutionally, and that we can see ways that other people in history tackled these moments of instability, of doubt, and how they actually recovered the tools that might build sediment in different ways, sometimes in new ways, but that in some ways that models exist that we would do well to meditate on and recover. So I don't think it's a waste. And in terms of their being failed, I don't think the Beguines really ever met a period of time where they were ever given any encouragement to exist. And so the fact that they did is just profit. Like it was, they were met immediately with suspicion. They faced breaks with family, cultural norms, ecclesiastical power. And so they, to me, everything about what they did was like, who can imagine what might have been built if they hadn't been met with such distrust? And so the fact, I'll just leave it at that. I actually don't have more of a rescue for who they are, other than I think our moment needs theirs. We need their moral witness, in part to enliven our own imaginations and to see what emerges.
Very well said. Thank you. So I want to, if we could, get into the harder piece here, which you just alluded to, this word distrust. And you said something very provocative, Laura, about 8 minutes ago. speaking very like personally, I think, and honestly, like I think quoting you said, my being female is reflecting on that as a challenge to God. And that's, I would love to go down that thread if you would be willing, but I'll use that as a conjunction to ask this notion of distrusting the Beguines, and I think more broadly, an understandable distrust of even those who operate as sort of like mothers in the world, even in public, whether they're biological mothers in their home, that we have a grid for that, obviously, but those who may bring a slightly more maternal style of leadership in public life. Chelsea and or Laura, does spiritual motherhood have an enemy or enemies? And did the Beguines, are these, if they did, are they nameable?
I can chime in really briefly with actually like a really lived example for me. So as I was reading Laura's essay, I kept thinking like, wow, these simple vows sound a lot like how Elizabeth Seton articulated the vows that her community would take. They would take 1-year vows initially, and they would let young women come who were not really willing, or at least their parents weren't willing to let them commit to a lifetime of covenant in a community that has a lot of options for women, but a lot of limitations. And so when I think about the enemies of whatever this is, of the kind of lovingly subversive groups like the Beguines existing in the world, one of the things I think about is in a love your enemies type of way, not like a let's kill them all, is because this is how I show up in the world. Like Laura referred to it as kind of amnesia, right? And I am very naturally wired to function in my head, to think about things linearly and legalistically. But when I wonder what happened to these threads and the stories between the formation of the Beguines and then the formation of these new spiritually innovative communities in early America and everything in between and all over the world, when we only value, for example, text. I'm like sitting here, like I'm going to be a 6-year-old and like a show and tell. And I think about like, letters we recently recovered from my great grandmother and like things like that. And I think about the material culture that the Beguines that Laura is mentioning, the artifacts that are birthed forth, that are not always just kind of the bibliographies we cite of the great works, which are very important, by the way. But I think the enemies to this way of being in the world that doesn't always look like the Beguines or Elizabeth Seton, but has this orientation, it is missing out on all of the other ways that, as Laura said, like that we know and that we value ways of knowing and being that are, centered on other senses, centered in other creaturely methods God's given us to communicate to each other and to him through. So whether that is, and this is also, I should say, if you haven't, in these principles Anne has set out in this month's issue of Comment. So things like embodiment, things like, I met Laura because I walked into a room and she invited me into a conversation she was already taking part in. And then she said, "Where are you from?" And I kept saying generally DC. And she's like, "Nowhere." And I was like, "Maryland." She's like, "Nowhere." And I said, "Well, around Baltimore." She's like, "Nowhere." And I finally said, "Catonsville." And she said, "I go to a convent there." And I said, "Is it the All Saints convent where my child and I have just discovered, and it's a mile from our house and we volunteer there every week and it heals our souls?" And Laura and I immediately found out that through nothing that we could do, through no bibliography, through no great theory of change or logic model that an institution came up with, don't get me wrong, I love those, I do that a lot, we had this connection that had bubbled up through generations and generations of God-fearing women and men, we should say. I saw a comment come in, question for you, Laura, really good one you should answer, about men who are champions for this, who even sometimes displace themselves to create this space. And by the way, I'm married to one of those people who's much more empathetic and exhibits these more archetypically feminine characteristics than I do. So I don't know, that's something for me, the enemy of spiritual motherhood. And I know Laura has said this kind of in where she's felt like that too. I feel sometimes I'm the enemy, my own internalization of what I know will ring the bells of status or institutional power or getting published somewhere. And those are all good things. They're not bad things. My question is there room in those conversations for these layers of cultural artifacts and artistic and creative expressions? And Laura didn't bring it up much, but if you read her piece, there is a great conversation between the birds and the Beguines, and the ways in which perhaps sometimes our own lens draws us to male birds that tend to have very elaborate plumage, although not all the time. And are we actually missing the beauty of some female birds? And do we actually understand the fullness of what it means to be a cardinal, for example, if we only understand cardinalness through what the male cardinal looks like? And so for me, that resonated so deeply, because the same day I read Laura's article, and I don't think this is an accident, I think this is God, I was reading my children a book called, oh gosh, what's it called? It's a very popular homeschool book, like the Boy Who Drew Birds, and it's about John James Audubon. And I don't know much about Audubon, and I'm reading this book to my daughter Phoebe, who is 1, and the whole book is about how he discovered the Eastern Phoebe, because no one was looking at these small birds. No one cared. They're not sexy like cardinals. And he figured out how to track them and realize that they don't magically disappear under the water every winter. They go south, and it's actually measurable. And so then science became interested in the Phoebes when we could measure their migratory patterns in empirical ways, and it was scientifically backed. But I wonder how many women, men who are just organically connected to their communities year after year, who are doing this for their own love of God's beauty and nature, and not to get some, society named after them like Audubon now has. So I just want to say thank you, Anne, for holding this space, because I think the enemy of spiritual motherhood is also very close to the heart of spiritual motherhood. And I think it exists in all of us. And maybe that's not the right language at all, but whatever the enemy of having whole-bodied, whole life communities with each other is, I think also exists within them.
Thanks, Chelsea. Laura, do you want to respond to that in any way before we move to audience questions here?
I think the only thing I would like to lift, besides just saying, I think what Chelsea said was beautiful. And I love that she held up a bird book actually related to from Catonsville, was my own. I think her point about that we can be our own enemy is a valuable one. I actually saw myself in some ways indicted in the sins that I was seeking to name. And I have been in some ways in a posture of confession and recognizing that I don't want to devalue the work that I do in the world, nor do I want to do that to others, men and women alike. I think it's too easy to be like, patriarchy is bad. I think men do suffer under patriarchy. I think patriarchy is an abstraction of a kind of emergent participation in sin that is difficult to get our brains around. But I think that men suffer under it just as much as women do. I am the daughter of a father who I would describe as having unique gifts with children and unique gifts in the kinds of spiritual motherhood practices, Chelsea, that you and your husband enumerate. And I think some of the idealistic language that we might have about being male or female or masculine and feminine can really inhibit sight and knowing in lots of lives. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, the boxes. Yeah. Oh, you guys are also creating a great runway. Some of you listening may know this, but Comet is taking a bit of a cultural huge risk. So you could pray for us, but our fall issue is going to be on gender and male, female, and the masculine, feminine. So wish us luck. It is obviously a hot topic to enter into, but Chelsea and Laura, you're providing, I think, like a very morally and theologically rigorous little red carpet for us to dive into this with some freedom and hope for a healthier public conversation on how we understand these boxes. So I want to turn to what I'm seeing a bit in the chat, and I may take liberties as moderator here because all of you, I'm so encouraged by this. You are thinking the way I'm thinking as I'm seeing some of these questions. So I'm going to ask them, and then I may weave them a little with ways in which I was planning to continue this conversation, if that's okay. So I'm going to go with this. Dana Wichterman. Hello, Dana. I'm just going to quote her question here. I love the phrase one of you used, a quote, a call to the small, e.g. hidden gems. Here's the question. How do we think about the appropriate hope to scale, widen our impact while not diminishing service to the one person in need? And if you will just stay with me a little longer, what I was going to ask, very, I think, synchronized with that is so much of what I was charmed by, inspired by in the Beguines and their witness as you educated me on them, Laura, and Chelsea, in our own conversations over these many months on spiritual motherhood, is this notion of hiddenness and the small and the quotidian and the ordinary. And, you know, here we are, we're in a recorded public setting. But I just have become convinced that there really is something. You think about pregnancy, obviously, as like not just metaphorically, but literally, there is something in hidden, nurtured, dark places where like true revelation can burst forth. And so I'm just curious how you think about sort of the lessons from the hidden depths of our labors and lives that you would like some of the more ambitious social change agents out there to keep in mind, whether we're talking about philanthropy, whether we're talking about the president of the United States, whether we're talking about you know, here I am, I'll just say it, I'm here at the Aspen Ideas Festival, whether I'm talking to the, you know, how do we like convey this to those that are self-consciously moving pretty big levers of change?
I can try to take a stab at that. I do not necessarily want this to turn into philanthropic policy. I'm not quite sure I can connect that dot all the way. I had recently a conversation on the pool deck of our local swimming pool with another mother, and she was talking about a school that her children go to. And my children attend our local public schools, and hers is in a more experimental sort of child-focused setting. And she said one of the things that really strikes her is how much focus there is on control and how much that gets in public schools and how much it gets translated into surveillance. And in terms of just how students experience learning. And then she said, but what I hear from teachers, whenever I describe like people that teach in public schools, when they hear about the school that I send my children to, they always say that can't scale. And I said to her, well, I think it depends on how we define scale. And I think the same could be said about all kinds of other measurements that we use to kind of calcify, institutionalize, intellectualize what we might call experiments in freedom that try to recapture what it means to be human and ensure that we are passing that along to our children and that we're offering it to others. I think part of what we all need to recapture, and I say this also to myself, is more of a spirit of creativity and play, and particularly take up experiments in freedom, and to do so almost deliberately not on scale, and to do lavish gifts of attention to others. And ideally, it would include at least one other person that may not have access to that kind of lavishness. I think part of our general malaise about how we meet people's needs comes from us not taking our own sense of moral agency and using it on behalf of another person, and that we can actually have a great deal of happiness and a discovery of our own playful, creative posture. This might look like, for instance, this will make it less hidden by my talking about it, but I'm right now involved in a very tiny book club and writing group with a 3rd grader and a 6th grader in my neighborhood. And we do writing exercises together, and we read out loud, and we circle words we don't know in a book that we're reading out loud together. And it's a brisk little experiment in freedom. And I am deliberately taking it on as a participant, not as the tutor or the teacher. And I submit to the task, and we all do it together. That takes, it's lavish. It is, but I would love to see other people kind of looking around their neighborhoods and seeing what need might be met, what skills might be imparted, and not necessarily feeling bound by the, I want to call it the poverty of wealth and the insecurity of power.
Mm. Laura, you're filled with like every phrase I want to put on my car. I don't even have bumper stickers, but thank you. Oof, yeah, we will transcribe this. I saw that in the chat. So this will be transcribed and we'll share it. Chelsea, can I just turn that question a little bit to you, just given that you inhabit now this place at the Fetzer Institute, which sounds, and I don't know how much you're free to share here, but has been quite open to unusually as a philanthropic entity in allowing this sort of nascent paradigm of spiritual motherhood to perhaps guide some of their giving, investments, partnerships, theories of change. How awkward is that conversation? Awkward meaning it just seems so sort of like an unusual, like apples and oranges to think about giving millions of dollars away with this other thing that's like so garden horticultural metaphorish. Could you talk a little bit about that pairing?
I can. I should say I'm a program officer at the Fetzer Institute. And so I'm not our board, who's incredible. I'm not our, executive leadership. This is a project that Fetzer did some funding for, and I'm extremely grateful. The Fetzer Institute is a foundation whose mission is to build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. And I was so interested in coming initially because of the way I was held in relationship with people, a few individuals that had been in relationship with me from the Institute. And normally when you are in, I think Anne knows this all too well, probably many of you do, when you are in a dynamic, a traditional paradigm of funding and then nonprofit, and you are navigating funding, there is a power dynamic at play. There always is, even in the best circumstances, and it's important to name. And I was so impressed that Fetzer did name that, and then sat down and had a 3-hour lunch. Not the Institute, the whole Institute, but individuals there would sit down and have a 3-hour conversation with me as a human, right? And I would bring my work forward, but I would bring the wholeness of who I am. And when I was approached about considering coming to the Institute, and then I went through the process, that is what it looked like. It looked like a lot of really deep personal conversation. Now let me be clear. It shouldn't require anyone to share their personal trauma or their deepest wound or anything like that. But in being invited to bring the wholeness of who you are, what I am so empowered by and inspired and honestly challenged by with people like Laura, when I sat down and read The Keys to Bonhoeffer's House, was she, right? Like, I mean, everyone knows the name Bonhoeffer. Everybody here is like able to say Bonhoeffer, and that means something in this community. And it's prestigious. And Laura knit together this beautiful story of how she became in relationship with Bonhoeffer, not just through reading his writings and then writing her own, new dissertation on Bonhoeffer. I apologize if anyone's doing that. That's very needed. But in relationship with her life, as the wife of a State Department worker, probably got that wrong, Laura, sorry, and children, and what it looked like to, I remember reading this this phase where she's like riding her bike through town, and I'm like getting motion sick reading it because it's so visceral. And so for me, this call to the small at Fetzer was doing that. It was bringing the fullness of everything, of the weird property and the stories about how the building came into place, and the stories of our partners into it. And so we're in this new process right now. Fetzer is, like many funders, considering how to do funding differently, coming out of COVID, coming out of a lot of, I would say, multiple levels of pandemic on spiritual and social levels, but also multiple levels of opportunity and growth. And the pandemic for Fetzer, at least, was kind of this incubation process where we were not meeting in person, our building was closed. And so now, as we think about strategy, language that has been shared, I love these questions, they're so God-driven. Scale, that is something Fetzer is talking a lot about right now, because when you think about, first of all, I think Fetzer does not believe that foundation should be the owners or even the seat of social change, right? Like that really has to start at a different level. but I am so happy to be at an institution that is holding space to say, yes, like sometimes growth and getting ideas out, and we have all probably been involved with national institutions on some level, requires some top-down work, requires some centralization. Does that necessarily though mean that that's the only way we measure that? How do we not even just empower? How do we listen to? How do we sit at the feet of? Laura just told us how she's sitting at the feet of the third grader in her neighborhood. How do we sit at the feet and lavish time, but not kind of from the perspective of I'm giving you my time because I'm the subject matter expert and you're learning from me. Lavish time on the small. So when I read Laura's essay and her children could name birds, right? Some birds that I don't even know. And then I saw my 3-year-old today. We have these little flower cards, and I'm reading The Story of a Soul with Teresa Lusso, Little Flower, and we're reading a children's book about that to our children. And we're also learning about gardening. And the fact that my 3-year-old has fluency in words like foxglove and African marigold, and I don't yet, and he's picked it up quicker than I have. It's very humbling to think, of course, Bonhoeffer can be my source. And so at Fetzer, I think, of course, beautiful theories of change about scale and quantification and growth can be our theories of change and can be our sources. But what does it look like to open up all of our lives to be our source? And so I'm so thrilled that Fetzer is continuing to explore that, although we haven't reached any definitive language. What I will say is I am most excited about the idea of working with people on the ground to hear what they need, what they love, what they're doing well, and how those that fund can support them, rather than people that fund coming to people and saying, you need this, do you want money to do it? So I think shifting that paradigm while recognizing we still live in the old paradigm, and how can we hospice that old paradigm in a loving way and take the best from it, but really see it as a life cycle. So can we compost? I don't even want to say, can we compost patriarchy? Because patriarchy is not always wrong or bad, particularly benevolent patriarchy, but is there a way to compost things that are just kind of naturally dying in this season, and how can they bring new life in the next?
Thank you, both of you. Thank you. I want to, this is a great question. There's a practicality to it from Daryl Dorr, his second question for Laura, but I'm going to toss it to both of you. He asks, what are contemporary applications of, quote, simple vows for women and for men and for intentional communities that are forward facing? You may need a second to think about that. But I mean, Laura, you kind of even gave an example with your neighborhood practice. But contemporary applications of simple vows. Go ahead.
I can't say that I've entered into a vow, but I will say in one of the fabulous conversations I had with Erin Reish Soutendam for this article, and she's now a doctored student of, or she's no longer a student, but properly a doctor of female biblical hermeneutics in the medieval period from Duke. What she mentioned is that I think what the Beguines demonstrate is that there really is a hunger for demanding religious lifestyle. And she actually, that also contains flexibility. And she said, look, you could look at like CrossFit. Like there are people that get really like into CrossFit, and it's a high demand lifestyle, and they're shoving tires around and that kind of thing. People are actually hungry, I think, for vowed constraint and for the constraints that come with community that is organized around constraint and disciplined freedom. And so I actually think that these examples abound. It's just that we don't often see them as being religious in nature. But I think there's a deep hunger for that, and a deep hunger to experience, I think, moments of transcendence in community that are, I think, forward-facing, if I understand as being more world-facing. So there are groups out there that they call themselves Beguines. I actually haven't researched contemporary examples of them deeply. So mine was more of an exploration of the history. but they're out there. And I think the place where how we actually enact vows. Oh yeah. And this is, yes, thank you, Daryl. This is the common rule. I think all of the exploration around rules of life or praying, it's one of the things I don't feel like I've talked about sufficiently here is the hidden nature of prayer, and prayer as being essential, I think, to this, like a truly contemplative, word-oriented, grazing on scripture, a place where we actually are making contact with God, and that actually is as part of the animating and ballasting feature to what we would properly call contemplative activity in the world. It does have to have that. It's not just activity. It's not just vows. It's vows to God, and then orienting to our neighbors, and seeing the world through God's eyes and through the love of neighbor as well. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some crucial ingredient, which I think of shared time, which is kind of the major quandary of our late modern age, how to create shared time the way you can in a monastic community.
Yeah.
So we have 3 minutes left, and I'm going to slip in one last question here that I think is important. Laura, you and I have actually talked about this. This is a question from Jenny Savage to Chelsea. Chelsea, could you give some examples or an example of how the life stages of biological motherhood translate into spiritual motherhood?
It's a great question. I'm probably going to trouble it a little bit. I think that could be a whole project, right? Like it could be a whole academic project or artistic project or something. The term actually was not related to biological maternity, which is why I found it fascinating, because if I'm going to put my cards on the table, I was drawn to this way of knowing and being, because motherhood did not come easily for me. I will spare you my story, but I had 3 children in 2.5 years, and it was a rough go. And so I think you could probably map it like that. But I think the term actually originated from religious communities where women were mostly not biological mothers because they'd vowed their lives to God. And so then the question is, my husband is part of a Lakota community, and there are many women there. Most, like the average age is like 70 something. And I'm in a community group with some of them, and I'm like 40 years younger than the youngest member. And most of them don't have biological children for whatever personal reasons. And some of them are tragic. And they share that it is, the question is, how are you going to be fruitful and multiply? Like that doesn't, in whether you're a biological parent or not, the question is like, what is God giving you right now to incubate? What is God giving you right now to nurture? Like you need to nurture a helpless human, right? Like they do call like the postpartum period the 4th trimester, because human babies do not come out. If you've ever seen a lamb be born, they like get up and they shake themselves off and they can walk. That is not the case with human babies. You're all flappy. And so I would really ask yourself, like with this call to the small, with these vows, if we're making all the vows ultimately to God, but ideally to each other as well, like what are the vows you're making to yourself and God right now to incubate something that he's given you, or God, I say he for God, so that he's given you. What vows are you making to something small in your life? Like honestly, for me right now, it's like a tomato patch that needs a lot of loving care and attention. What are vows you can make toward that growth of, that stage of life that's young? There's a lot, my husband's a therapist. He's much better at like life stages than I am. But if you think about life stages and you think about possibly, a childhood aperture, and maybe you think about 3 or 4 stages that align with just different pieces of your life that God's calling you to nurture in different ways, right? A baby in the womb needs a different nurturing than a 12-year-old, right? And so I think that might be helpful to think about it like a life cycle, though. And for the call to the small, I do think a lot about that metaphor of the mother tree. If anyone's heard about that, it's not my concept, but there's now scientific evidence that shows there are these hub trees in old growth forests where there's thriving, 500 to 1,000-year-old old growth forests where we haven't cut them down. And the networks under the tree root systems have now been mapped scientifically, and they nurture each other, and not in this like linear way where it's like a graph, right? It's entangled. It is rhizomatic, it's messy, but there's always these hub trees in the old growth forest whose roots go out to all of their children and their children's children. And the thing that's important here, and to trees that are not even their own species. So I think when you start by nourishing what's closest to you, then God gives us the capacity to not even see whether it's generational, multi-generational, right? Like we didn't, like those that were coming out of Egypt did not see the promised land. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think it could probably be mapped onto a literal woman's body life cycle. But I think whatever that organic life cycle that speaks to you would be a place to start and ask, are you only picking the fruit, or are you equally interested in protecting and nourishing the roots?
That's a beautiful way to close out. I couldn't say it better. Chelsea, Laura, thank you so much. I hope for all of you who have attended, this has been a bit unusual of a conversation, and will stay with you as a seed that will generate new life in your relationships, your work, your thinking, your engagement in our public sphere, and the private sphere as well. So thank you so much, and feel free to come back again when we do another one of these, hopefully in a month or two. Adios.